This question belongs to computer organization subject and the topic name is interrupt. It was asked in GATE CSE 1987. So the question states, on receiving an interrupt from a IO device, the CPU does what of this? Halts for a predetermined time, hands over control of address bus and data bus to the interrupting device, branches off to the interrupt service routine immediately, or it branches off to the interrupt service routine after completion of the current instruction. So what an interrupt is like CPU, there is an instruction that is being executed. Now an IO device which can be your CPU or it can be a mouse or printer or anything wants to do some task or wants to get some service, then it will send an interrupt signal to the CPU, and CPU will then do the necessary action based on this interrupt signal. So it's asking what happens when an interrupt signal comes. So it's a predefined things like what happens when an interrupt comes. Let me tell you all these things. So what happens is that suppose CPU is executing the program. So after completion of the program, after completion of each instruction, not within the instruction, like interrupt may come at any point, but after completion of each instruction, it will check the interrupt pin, whether an interrupt has came or not. Like suppose a interrupt came somewhere in middle and it got caught when the instruction ended. So what happens is that CPU checks the status bit of the interrupt at completion of each current instruction running, whether there is an interrupt, and when there is an interrupt, then it calls the interrupt service routine. So after completion of each instruction, it will check and then it will call an interrupt service routine. So what an interrupt service routine is that interrupt service routine is basically a software routine that hardware invokes in response to an interrupt. Interrupt service routine basically examines the interrupt and determines how to handle the interrupt. And what happens during this execution, there are some steps which happen. It's necessary to like remember them. So what happens is that the interrupt handler will determine the cause of the interrupt. It will perform the necessary processing according to this interrupt service routine, and then it will perform a state restore after the processing and will execute a return from interrupt instruction to the return control of the CPU. So the program control returns to the interrupted program over here, and then it will start executing from the next instruction where it was interrupted. So the options are halts for a predetermined time. No, it doesn't halt. Hands over control of address bus and database to the interrupting device. No, this is also false. Branch off to the interrupt service routine immediately. No, not immediately. After execution, completion of the current instruction, it will branch off. Branch off to the interrupt service routine after completion of the current instruction. Yes, option D is correct.